Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 515, and today is December 20th, 2023. I got a lot of news for you on today's show, but first want to remind everyone that we are holding our end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We only ask for help to keep our doors open twice a year, and your donation ensures that the Libertarian Institute is able to continue to produce independent content that challenges the narrative that is often coming from Washington, especially on the war issue, which is mainly what I cover there. I'm the news editor. I write news stories every day, as well as put out this podcast and the daily news roundup. For anybody who's made a contribution to the Institute already, I really appreciate it. If you haven't done it yet, it's a great time to do so because we do have matching funds. A generous contributor donated $10,000 if we could find $10,000 worth of smaller matching donation. So head on over to the Institute, help us out. We really appreciate it, and we'll continue to produce great content for y'all. Now let's get into today's show. First up here is a new poll, a Monmouth poll, university poll released on Monday, shows that Biden's approval rating is at a record low 34%, with his vice president Kamala Harris polling just slightly better at 35%. Both Biden and Harris actually have twice double the approval rating of Congress, which is sitting at 17%. Now, unfortunately, this poll didn't actually get into the foreign policy issue whatsoever. So all the questions asked were around the domestic issue, which, Biden isn't doing well on, inflation, all these other things. But I really think if, you kind of look at how his approval rating has continued to dip here in the latter half of 2023, you assume that at least a part of that has to do with most Americans being unhappy in some form with his foreign policy, whether it's too much support for Ukraine, too much support for Israel, all this stuff. I'm sure some people don't like Biden because he's not aggressive enough too, but there's a lot of Americans who are very upset with having a too hawkish foreign policy under the Biden administration. All right, next up here, Pentagon warns software issue will shut down F-35 production. Lieutenant General Michael Schmidt, the program executive officer and director of the F-35 Lightning program, provided written testimony to the House Armed Services Subcommittee last week that software issues could delay foreign sales of the F-35. His letter said development and production concurrently is Block 4's most critical challenge, and we are dealing with this with its consequences today. The F-35 Joint Program Office, Lockheed Martin, and other industry partners have identified high-risk concurrency in the F-35's Block 4 schedule, which would threaten to shut down aircraft production development if development slips. And so this seems pretty important. I'm not sure exactly all the ins and outs of the F-35, but this the Block 4 is apparently a software issue that they're having with the program, and so we will see if if they're not able to get this fixed, then it's going to cause production shortages, and then they're going to delay sales. All right, next up here, some news on Ukraine. White House says U.S. can only fund one more weapons shipment package for Ukraine. The White House said on Monday that a weapons package will be provided to Ukraine later this month, and then after that, the U.S. will be out of funds to arm Ukraine until Congress authorizes more spending for the proxy war. According to Politico, the Pentagon still has $4.4 billion in presidential drawdown authorities, which allows the U.S. to send weapons to Ukraine straight from military stockpiles, but the U.S. will run out of funds needed to replenish the arms being sent. Mike McCord, the Pentagon's comptroller, said the Congress was made aware of the situation by a letter that he sent on Monday. And so this sounds a little bit like what I've been saying on the show and why the whole $6 billion accounting error really did make sense. And what they're saying here is they do have $4.4 billion left in the presidential drawdown authority funds, but they don't have funds needed to replenish the arms being sent to Ukraine. And that's a discrepancy I think the White House essentially and the Pentagon essentially invented this summer with that $6 billion accounting error. I think before the presidential drawdown authority would work is if you send weapons to Ukraine, the funding from Congress goes to purchase weapons to replace the ones sent to Ukraine, not the way the White House now, they evaluate the dollar amount of the weapons sent, which has created this about $4 billion discrepancy, I guess. It's probably about $6 billion overall, the size of the accounting error. So in McCord's letter, he said, "We are planning one more aid package to Ukraine later this month. However, when that one's done, as Comptroller McCord made clear in his note to Congress today, we will have no more replenished authority available to us, and we're going to need Congress to act without delay, as we have been saying." So I'm not sure how this actually impacts the $300 million that Congress passed for Ukraine as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm guessing that'll give the White House another little pool of money to be able to use to send weapons to Ukraine. And my guess is that they're hoping the weapons they're sending gets Ukraine through, say, mid-January or so, at which point Congress will have been back in session, and the White House is hoping that they will pass this $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Israel and Taiwan, as well as $60 billion for Ukraine. Now, next up here, Ukraine has an ammunition shortage. I wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute on December 18th. Ukraine replanning military operations due to ammo shortage. A top Ukrainian commander warned that Kiev's ammunition depots are running low, causing military leaders to reassess operations. The statement comes as the White House says it only has funding for one more weapons package for Ukraine. A Ukrainian brigadier general said Monday that the military was replanning its efforts due to shortages seen across the entire front lines, and he called the shortages a very big problem. The brigadier general said, "There's a problem with ammunition, especially post-Soviet shells, that's 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter, and today these problems exist across the entire front line. The volumes that we have today are not sufficient for us given our needs. So we are redistributing it. We are replanning tasks that we had set for ourselves, and we are making them smaller because we need to provide for them." He added and went on to note that the Ukraine was scaling back some offensive operations, and in some places where they are conducting small-scale offensive operations, now they are just looking to set up defensive lines. I read a separate article, and I'm not sure if this was maybe the West trying to challenge Ukraine a little bit, but it outlined that Ukraine had actually started to deprioritize artillery and was more prioritizing putting munitions, small explosives onto drones, because they feel like that's maybe a more efficient use of their explosive material at this time. Kiev is currently ordering its troops to attempt to establish a foothold on the eastern shore of the Dnieper River in southern Ukraine. A soldier engaged in the battle said, "It's not even a fight for survival. It's a suicide mission. I didn't see anything like this in Bakhmut or Soledar. It's so wasteful." And so this is, an interesting, that statement from the soldier coming around the same time that we have an Ukrainian officer saying they're scaling back these military operations is interesting. I think that landing on the eastern side of the Dnieper River was maybe a little bit of a propaganda attempt by the Ukrainians. They need to, especially when Zalinsky comes to Washington, they want headlines in the American media saying that, oh, the Ukrainians are gaining ground, oh, the war's going well for the Ukrainians. And so I wonder, I speculate if Kiev pushed for this operation to try to establish a foothold on the eastern shore of the Dnieper River in order for Zalinsky to have something to tout when he came to Washington. But we see that it's really not going so well by this statement from that soldier. Ukraine's Western backers are producing fewer artillery shells, than Ukraine is producing. Washington depleted its 155 millimeter shell stockpile, resulting in Biden sending Kiev cluster munitions. Throughout the conflict, Western leaders have pushed Ukraine to use fewer artillery shells. However, Kiev has continued to use shells at a high rate and complained that their Western backers do not understand the current battlefield. So this, is debate that's been happening for a while in Ukraine between Ukraine and its Western backers about what kind of tactics it should be using on the battlefield. And there's been some pretty stark differences on a couple of things, but including the artillery shells and, how to engage in high casualty maneuvers. All right, next up here, this from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Zalinsky suggests Ukraine can mobilize up to 500,000 new soldiers. Ukrainian President Zalinsky said Tuesday that Ukraine's military leadership proposed mobilizing 450,000 to 500,000 new conscripts to fight Russia as Kiev is dealing with a manpower shortage. The Ukrainian leader said he needs to hear more about the plan before he ordering the mobilization. He said, "This is a serious number. I said I need more arguments to support this direction. I need concrete information on what will then happen with the 1 million military of Ukraine." Zalinsky's government has already been taking desperate measures and abusing its power under martial law to fill its reins. The New York Times reported on December 15th that the Ukrainian army recruiters have become increasingly aggressive in their efforts to replenish the ranks, in some cases pulling men off the street and whisking them into recruiting centers using intimidation and even physical force. The aggressive tactics have been used against men who ordinarily would have been exempted from the draft. At least in one case, a man diagnosed with a mental disability, and it looks like probably a low IQ functioning situation, mental disability as a child. That's typically what people mean. And he received a summons by recruiters, but his conscription was fortunately prevented by a lawyer. Under martial law, men ages 18 to 60 are barred from leaving the country, but anyone under the age of 27 without prior military service is exempt from the draft. Ukraine's parliament passed a bill lowering the age to 25 that Zalinsky is yet to sign, but he signaled that he will, and if he does, that would add another 140,000 men, they estimate, into their military. Although, if that's like a pre-war estimate of how many 25 to 27-year-old men there are in Ukraine, it may be lower today. They may not have success in getting all 140,000 men to go to the recruitment center and agree to conscription. A lot of them may try to leave the country. When asked if we would approve a mobilization for men and women under 25, Zalinsky said, "Women, no. I will not sign it. As for 25-year-old men, yes, if all the arguments are presented. As of today, I see it as necessary, so I will agree with it." So a lot of people have been talking about, and there's been quite a few reports out about women being drafted or conscripted, kind of picked up and shoved into these recruitment centers like the men in Ukraine. And I have seen plenty of reports of that. I have not seen anything official from the Ukrainian government. So maybe it's happening on low level and a regional level. Maybe Ukraine is offering bonuses or things for their military recruiters. And so there's some overzealous recruiters who will even pick up some women and really force them into the recruitment centers if that is possible. Dave finishes up his article here. Ukraine's efforts to fill its ranks come as it has become clear that Ukrainians' forces cannot beat the Russians on the battlefield, and Ukrainian Marines have said they're being sent on suicide missions across the Dnieper River. Despite the reality on the ground, President Biden is seeking over $60 billion in funds for the war to fund the war for another year, which has yet to be approved due to partisan debate over border policies. Zalinsky said he is confident that the U.S. will continue funding the war in his government. And I think Zalinsky is probably right about that. However, this debate has gone on far longer than I thought it would. I really thought they would have had this resolved at least last month, before Thanksgiving. And now we're coming up on Christmas here. And so we'll see just how long the Republicans are willing to hold out. Next up here, U.S. granted access to 15 military bases in Finland under New Deal. The U.S. and Finland signed a new defense cooperation agreement on Monday that gives the U.S. access to 15 military bases in the Nordic nation, which shares an over 800-mile-long border with Russia. According to a Finnish outlet, the northernmost site in the agreement is a border guard base in a small town located just 30 miles from the Russian border. Moscow has warned that it will respond to the expansion of NATO infrastructure in Finland, the alliance's newest member, by building up military assets in Western Russia. The Kremlin said on Friday that the defense cooperation agreement will increase tensions in the region. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, "This will certainly lead to tensions. We can only regret this. We had an excellent relationship with Finland. No one threatened anyone, and there were no problems or complaints against each other. No one infringed on anyone's interests. There was mutual respect. But now, when Finland is a NATO member and NATO's military infrastructure will already enter Finnish territory, this will pose an obvious threat to us. The DCA needs to be approved by the Finnish parliament," and Secretary of State Antony Blinken said once that goes into effect, our militaries will be able to collaborate more efficiently and more effectively. Our troops will move opportunities to train together, and we will bolster NATO's interoperability. The U.S. already signed a similar deal with Sweden, which gives the U.S. access to 17 bases. Sweden is still waiting for Turkey and Hungary to ratify its NATO membership, and just yesterday, I saw the Turkish government was leaning on the U.S. and Canada to make some concessions that will prompt Turkey to go ahead and consent to Sweden's NATO membership. And once that happens, I expect that Hungary will follow relatively quickly. All right, one more story here on the situation in Europe. Germany to permanently deploy 4,800 troops to Lithuania. Germany is set to permanently station 4,800 troops in Lithuania as part of NATO's military buildup in Eastern Europe aimed at Russia. Lithuania shares a border with Kaliningrad, the Russian oblast on the Baltic Sea that's separated from the Russian mainland. Germany already leads the NATO deployment in Lithuania with 1,000 troops, but an agreement signed on Monday will establish a permanent home for the German soldiers. The new German units will be located in 2 locations. One is about 60 miles from the border with Kaliningrad, and then the other is near the Lithuanian capital, and just about 20 miles from Russia's ally Belarus. With German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius signing the deal and his Lithuanian counterpart on Monday, he said, "With this war-ready brigade, we are assuming leadership responsibility here in the alliance and NATO's eastern flank. The speed of the project clearly shows Germany understands the new security realities." All right, next up here, we got a couple stories on China before we get into the Gaza news. U.S. increasing military exercises with allies near China. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The U.S. is increasing military exercises with its allies in the Asia Pacific, and those are meant as a message to China, the commander of the U.S. Navy's Japanese-based 7th Fleet told the Washington Times. This is Vice Admiral Carl Thomas, and he said the stepped-up exercises were meant to, quote, deter China, but tensions have only increased in the region, especially in the South China Sea, making conflict more likely. Thomas said he believes being forward and having many nations working together is a grand deterrent effect that we are really trying to amplify. Everything we do, whether it's being present and forward or whether it's doing exercises with our like-minded allies and partners, it's about deterring aggression. Over the past year, the U.S. has bolstered its alliance with the Philippines and increased joint military activity in the South China Sea, where China and the Philippines and several other Southeast Asian nations have overlapping claims. The U.S. has committed to ongoing war despite dispute by affirming that the U.S. and Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on the Philippines vessels in the South China Sea. The increased military ties between the U.S. and Philippines have coincided with a significant uptick in dangerous encounters between the Chinese and Philippines vessels in the South China Sea near a disputed reef. The Philippines president, Marcos Jr., who came into office last year, has taken a much more aggressive approach in pushing back on China's claims than his predecessor, Duterte. China has also demonstrated it will not back down in the face of growing U.S. military presence in the region. The U.S. has been encouraging other allies in the region to increase military ties with the Philippines, including Japan and Australia. France, Canada, and other Western nations are also increasing their presence in the South China Sea. Despite The focus on supporting war in Ukraine and Gaza, the U.S. military buildup aimed at China, is still in full swing, which also includes establishing more bases in the region. The U.S. plans to deploy new military systems and unprecedented support for Taiwan. U.S. military officials have openly stated they are planning to prepare for a future fight with China. And then the second article on China here, again from Day to Camp, this December 19th, U.S. approves $300 million sale for Taiwan's military information systems. The State Department has approved a potential $300 million arms sales to Taiwan in support of the island's tactical information systems, the Pentagon announced on December 15th. According to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, that's the DSCA, the deal includes lifecycle support and equipment for command, control, communications, and computer, which are called C4 capabilities, a military information system that is meant to synchronize joint forces. The State Department's approval begins a period when Congress reviews the sale and can block it, but there is a near unanimous bipartisan support for arming Taiwan. China is strongly opposed to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and has condemned the deal. China's foreign military spokesperson, Wang Wenbin, said on Monday, this move seriously underestimates China's sovereignty and security interests, harms peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and sends the wrong message to separatist forces seeking Taiwan's independence. China deplores and strongly opposes this and has made solemn demarche is to the U.S.'s side. No matter how many weapons the U.S. provides to Taiwan, it will neither change historic course of China's reunification nor weaken Chinese people's firm will in safeguarding our national sovereignty and his territorial integrity. All right, next up here is an article I wrote on the situation in North Korea, which is continuing to spiral, the tensions there. So North Korea has tested an intercontinental ballistic missile amid escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula. The launch followed the USS Missouri, a nuclear submarine, making a stop in South Korea. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un watched the intercontinental ballistic missile launch. Following the test of the missile, Kim said, according to North Korean state media, quote, the launching drill sent a clear signal to the hostile forces who have fanned up their reckless military confrontation hysteria against North Korea all year round and are frantically maximizing it till the end of this year, despite the repeated stern warnings from North Korea. It was an occasion to clearly show the action of North Korea has been prepared and what options North Korea could take when Washington makes a wrong decision against it. North Korea needs to never overlook the reckless and irresponsible military threats of the enemy, destroying the bases of peace and security in the Korean Peninsula, and to strongly counter them with more offensive actions by adopting more evolutionary and threatening way when the enemies continue to make the wrong choice. Monday was the first time Pyongyang ordered a ICBM test in 5 months. According to the Associated Press, the South Korean government believes it was a solid-fueled rocket. The development means the ICBM can take less time to prepare and is therefore more challenging to detect. Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, spoke with his Japanese and South Korean counterparts. The three nations then condemned the North Korean missile launch. The UN Security Council is set to meet on Tuesday about the ICBM test at the request of the United States. The State Department spokesperson said these launches, like other ballistic missile tests Pyongyang has conducted this year, are in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. The commander of Indo-Pacific Command called the recent North Korean military activity concerning. The admiral said that North Korea's increased military capabilities and testing from ICBM all the way to the space vehicle launch last month is concerning. South Korea slammed the launch as a grave provocation and threatened international peace. The Central Military Commission of the Workers' Party of Korea said the test was in response to the U.S. and South Korean nuclear talks and the deployment of the USS Missouri. The North Korean military said on December 15th, the U.S. and the military gangsters of the Republic of Korea held a nuclear war confab called the Second Meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group in Washington and openly revealed their intention to conduct large-scale joint drills under simulated conditions of actual war of nuclear retaliatory strike aimed at North Korea, again crying out for the end of the regime. What should not be overlooked is the fact that the U.S. again dispatched its nuclear-powered submarine, the Missouri, to the Korean Peninsula as an extremely provocation action on December 15th to pose more grave threats to the security environment of North Korea and the region, loudly advertising it. The U.S. is not content with the frequent deployment of nuclear war hardware of various kinds, including nuclear strategic bombers, super large strategic nuclear submarines, and nuclear carriers in the Korean Peninsula to turn it into an assembly base for all the U.S. nuclear strategic assets. And so North Korea seems very concerned about what the U.S. is doing here. Now, I think there's two ways to look at this. One is that the North Koreans are legitimately concerned, and there's a legitimate chance, as they've been saying, that this could devolve into a nuclear war fairly quickly. The other is North Korea assesses that the U.S. really can't do anything to North Korea at this time. The U.S. is already bogged down in Ukraine and is now getting itself more involved in the Middle East and wants to be able to fight a war against China. And so maybe North Korea sees this as basically an opportunity to do one of two things: to confront the U.S. on their show of support type actions for South Korea. They really don't think this is preparation for a nuclear war. However, if the U.S. is, deploying its nuclear capable assets to South Korea, North Korea is going to feel that if they don't carry out a show of force in response, then that is going to be seen as being intimidated by the Americans. And so, they see the test as a part of that, but also it kind of has a second and maybe more important purpose, which is with the Americans all tied up across the world, maybe they feel they could test a lot of their weapon systems at this time, their ICBMs and things like that, because the Americans couldn't deliver a military response at this point in time. All right, next up, the dismal situation in Gaza. Human Rights Watch says Israel using starvation as weapon of war. Human Rights Watch released a report on Monday that said Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza by using starvation as a weapon of war against civilians. Human Rights Watch said Israeli forces are deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel while willfully impeding humanitarian assistance, apparently razing agricultural areas and depriving the civilian population of objects indispensable to their survival. The report pointed to comments from Israeli officials expressing their aim to deprive Palestinian civilians of food and other basic necessities. At the beginning of the onslaught, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant announced a complete siege on the already blockaded Gaza Strip and said the military was fighting human animals. Israel has since allowed limited deliveries of aid through Gaza's border crossing with Egypt, but Human Rights Watch says the amount of aid is grossly insufficient levels. UN officials have said the increased Israeli military operations in South Gaza made relief efforts impossible. For over 2 months, Israel has been depriving Gaza's population of food and water, a policy spurred on and endorsed by high-ranking Israeli officials and reflecting an intent to starve civilians as a method of warfare. Human Rights Watch Israel and Palestinian director said world leaders should be speaking out against this abhorrent war crime, which has devastating effects on Gaza's population. Earlier this month, the UN World Food Program said that 9 out of 10 households in northern Gaza and 2 out of 3 households in southern Gaza have spent at least one full day and night without food. Besides the food deprivation in Gaza, the siege is also spreading due to a lack of clean water and other conditions caused by the Israeli siege. The Israeli bombardment and ground invasion has killed over 19,000 Palestinians, including 7,500 children. As the onslaught continues, the risk of Palestinians dying of disease and starvation en masse continues to grow. Despite the Israeli atrocities, the U.S. is still providing unconditional military support for the massacre. Now, the second article, which I think, kind of combines with that first one very well, is one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on December 19th. Israel raids one of the last hospitals in North Gaza. Israeli soldiers raided one of the last functioning hospitals in northern Gaza. The military operations on the medical facility forced the Al-Ali hospital to close its doors. According to the Associated Press, Israeli forces raided the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza City overnight. According to the church that operates it, destroying a wall at the front entrance and detaining most of its staff. The raid left the hospital damaged and understaffed. Don Bitter, a pastor at St. George's Anglican Cathedral, which runs the hospital, said the attack left just 2 doctors, 4 nurses, and 2 janitors to tend to over 100 seriously wounded patients with no running water or electricity. He explained the Israeli tank was parked on the rubble at the hospital's entrance, blocking anyone from entering or leaving. The head of the orthopedic surgery at the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza, Fadel Naim, said the doctors were arrested and 4 wounded patients have died since the raid. Haaretz has reported that several Palestinians detained by Israel in Gaza have died in captivity. Binder said, It has been great mercy for the many wounded in Gaza City that we have been able to keep our hospital open for so long. That ended today. The AFP reported the hospital was shut down on Tuesday. A source explained the raid put the hospital out of action. We can't receive any patients or injured. Nam said the shuttering of the hospital left wounded Palestinians suffering on the streets outside of the damaged building. He told AFP, according to our information, there are dozens of wounded surrounding the wounded in the surrounding streets, and he means the streets surrounding the hospital. Last week, the World Health Organization described the state of Al-Ali Hospital as utter chaos and humanitarian disaster zone. The staffers who visited the facility said it is extremely congested with many displaced people and over 200 patients, while it only has enough resources to support 40, half of the original bed capacity. The press release added, the building has sustained substantial damage because of the hostilities. The World Health Organization says Israeli military operations in Gaza have decimated the besieged enclave's healthcare system. Last week, the organization said only 14 of Gaza's hospitals were still functioning, and I believe at least two hospitals in northern Gaza, including the Al-Ali hospital, have been shut down since then. So that is just awful and disgusting. Now, one of the things I want to mention here is something that I've been saying on the show time and time again, but I really want to reinforce. When we're looking and talking about potential genocide occurring in Gaza, where Israel is not just, trying to wipe out Hamas, as they say, or punish the Palestinians that live there for the Hamas attack on October 7th, but are actually trying to kill a large portion of the population of Gaza and force the rest of that population to leave the Gaza Strip. So if you're going to do that, most people have in mind this idea of Israel is going to use bombs and bullets to accomplish that mission, to kill all these Palestinians. However, half the Palestinian population is under the age of 18, huge percentage of the population of Gaza under the age of 5. And so if you're looking at how to kill children and elderly, well, you could certainly do that with bombs and bullets, but there's a certain cruelty there that probably would lead to a lot of wrath facing Israel. However, another option of what you can do is simply to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. And what does that mean? It's going to kill an awful lot of the people that live there, including the children, the people under 18, and the elderly are going to be the most significantly impacted by this. So it certainly seems like Israel's goal here is a genocide. That's why they've decimated the food and the healthcare system, because they know if you're not eating and you're getting sick, a lot of people will end up dead that way. Now, this does not curtail U.S. support whatsoever. This from Day to Camp. Lloyd Austin visits Israel, vows to continue support for Gaza slaughter. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin met with Israeli officials in Tel Aviv on Monday and vowed support for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza despite the massive civilian casualty rate. In a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Austin said that the U.S. commitment to Israel is unshakable. According to the Times of Israel, American commitment to Israel is unwavering and no individual group or state should try to test its resolve. Austin said the U.S. would continue to provide Israel with the equipment that you need to defend your country, referring to bombs and other military aid that the U.S. has been shipping to Israel since October 7th on a near daily basis. U.S. officials have said they want Israel to wrap up the current phase of the war, which involves constant airstrikes and the ground campaign, in the next few weeks and take a more targeted approach to Hamas. Austin said the U.S. has thought about more surgical operations, but made clear that the timeline for the onslaught is up to Israel. At a press conference with Austin, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant said the Israeli military will continue to operate in different levels of intensity as it sees fit and will eventually be able to transition gradually to the next phase. When discussing civilian casualties, Austin said that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral duty and strategic imperative, but also gave cover for the Israeli slaughter of civilians. He said the density of Gaza's population makes it very, very difficult to conduct any military operations. While the U.S. claims they are concerned about civilians' casualties in Gaza, they are still not considering placing any conditions on the military aid or limits the weapons that the U.S. provide to Israel. Since October 7th, the Israeli onslaught has killed over 19,000 Palestinians, including 7,500 children. Now, there is some renewed hope that we could have another ceasefire in Gaza, although Israel is emphasizing it would be a temporary one. This from the Financial Times. Israel shows renewed interest in hostage agreement after killing Israeli captives in Gaza. So according to the Financial Times, negotiations between Qatar and the Israel and the U.S. spy agency chiefs over the remaining hostages kidnapped by Hamas have taken on new urgency after the Israeli military shot and killed 3 of its citizens in Gaza. And it does seem that killing in particular maybe gives a little bit of insight into how cruel and just all-encompassing the Israeli military operations in Gaza are. Apparently, those 3 Israeli captives had either escaped or been let go by their Hamas captors. They are walking around without shirts on, waving a white flag, and they were still gunned down by Israeli forces. So back to the Financial Times article. The talks have been stalled for weeks, resumed on Monday in Warsaw. One source described the talks as positive, but added that there is no deal imminent. This from Axios. Israel tells the U.S. Hezbollah must be pushed 6 miles from Israel-Lebanon border. So Axios reports Israel told the Biden administration it wants Hezbollah forces pushed aggressively 6 miles from the border as a part of a diplomatic deal to end tensions with Lebanon. Israeli forces said Netanyahu and Gallant told Austin that Israel couldn't accept that tens of thousands of its citizens were displaced for months because of the security situation on the other side of the border. Netanyahu and Gallant said Israel wants a deal that includes pushing Hezbollah forces far enough that they will not be able to fire at the Israeli villages and towns along the border, or to be able to cut the raid like the one Hamas conducted on October 7th. The Israeli Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense told Austin that as a part of the agreement, they want Hezbollah not to be allowed to go back to its positions along the border, which Israel has destroyed over the past 2 months. The IDF and Hezbollah have traded fire along the border since October 7th. Israeli forces have killed journalists and used U.S.-provided white phosphorus in Lebanon. The Hezbollah leader says his forces are conducting operations to prevent Tel Aviv from using its full military might against Gaza, and they don't want this to devolve into an all-out war with Israel. At the same time, the U.S. plan seems to be very problematic, pushing the Hezbollah fighters 6 miles from the border is likely going to create an issue. The Lebanese army is really not strong enough to repel the Israelis, and the Israelis have made it clear that they are looking for a permanent change to the situation between themselves and Hezbollah, and with an idea of officials signaling that could come in the form of a military operation. So moving your most effective fighting force in Lebanon away from the border and replacing it with a less effective one could just be grounds to give Israel a softer target in southern Lebanon. All right. 2 more stories here. First, Houthis say they won't back down even if U.S. mobilizes the entire world. Yemen's Houthis responded to the U.S. launching a new military operation in the Red Sea by vowing attacks on commercial shipping in the region will continue even if the U.S. mobilizes the entire world. The U.S. launched a 10-nation naval task force dubbed Operation Prosperity Guardian after major shipping companies began pausing Red Sea transits due to Houthi attacks. Bahrain is the only Arab country to participate in the coalition, and no nations with coasts on the Red Sea have joined. Even if America succeeds and mobilizes the entire world, our military operations will not stop, no matter the sacrifices it costs us, a senior member of the Houthis' political bureau wrote on X. In another post, the official said, America's announcement of the establishment of the Coalition of Shame will not prevent us from continuing our military operations until the crime of genocide in Gaza is stopped and food, medicine, and fuel are allowed to enter its besieged population. The Houthis have vowed to target all commercial vessels heading to or from Israeli ports and have also fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. In some cases, U.S. warships have intervened and intercepted Houthi attacks. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, have controlled Yemen's capital since 2014 and govern the area of Yemen where 70 to 80% of Yemen's population lives. The U.S. is considering taking direct military action against the Houthis, which would mean bombing Yemen, a step that could shatter the fragile truce that has held in the country since April of 2022. The U.S. is also threatening to kill a Saudi Houthi peace deal by redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make the implementation of any agreement to end the war impossible. For its part, Saudi Arabia is asking the Houthis, the U.S. not to strike the Houthis directly over concerns that it would provoke more attacks, and I guess some of those attacks would likely be directed at the Saudis. And then last up here, this from DateToCampAntiwar.com. U.S. airstrike reported in Somalia for the first time in months. The U.S. launched an airstrike in southern Somalia on Sunday as a part of an operation in collaboration with the Mogadishu-based government, Voice of America reported. The U.S.-backed government claimed the operation killed a senior al-Shabaab commander. U.S. Africa Command, that's AFRICOM, confirmed the accuracy of the government's report to Voice of America, which is U.S.-funded state media, although AFRICOM did not announce the strike through a press release as it usually does. This happens all the time where the U.S. and the Mogadishu government will claim that they killed members of al-Shabaab, but often, if any journalists do turn up in Somalia, they find that civilians are, if not the only dead, among the dead. And so the strikes are never as successful as they claim. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more later in the week.